Frank Thompson sighed as he adjusted his ill-fitting uniform. At 65, he never thought he'd be working as a glorified doorman, but life had a way of throwing curveballs. He stood at attention outside the sprawling mansion of Ethan Blackwell, tech mogul, and self-proclaimed visionary. The morning sun glinted off the polished windows, reminding Frank of the life he once led. 20 years as a top-notch security expert, and now he was reduced to opening doors and fetching newspapers. But he needed this job. Sarah's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. As if on cue, a sleek black Bentley pulled up the driveway. Frank straightened his posture, preparing for another day of subtle jabs and condescending remarks. Ethan Blackwell stepped out, designer sunglasses perched on his nose, not even sparing Frank a glance. "Thompson, make sure my Armani suit is pressed for tonight's gala, and for God's sake, do something about that atrocious cologne. You smell like a retirement home." Frank bit his tongue. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell." Inside the mansion, Frank navigated the maze of corridors, each step a reminder of his fall from grace. He passed by the security room, state-of-the-art systems gleaming behind reinforced glass. His fingers itched to be at those controls again, but those days were long gone. "Hey, Grandpa," a voice called out. It was Jason, Blackwell's head of security, a cocky youngster who thought a few years of CrossFit made him invincible. "Don't forget to wipe down the dog's paws when they come back from their walk. We can't have dirty prints on Mr. Blackwell's imported rugs." Frank nodded, swallowing his pride. He'd taken down armed mercenaries in his prime, but here he was, reduced to a geriatric janitor. As the day wore on, Frank found himself organizing Blackwell's tie collection, a task so mind-numbingly dull he considered quitting on the spot. But then Sarah's face flashed in his mind, her smile weak but still radiant despite the chemotherapy. He couldn't let her down. Evening approached, and the mansion buzzed with activity. The annual charity gala was Blackwell's chance to show off his wealth while pretending to care about the less fortunate. Frank watched as the rich and powerful filed in, their laughter echoing off marble floors. He stood in the corner, invisible to the guests. A waiter rushed past, nearly knocking him over. "Watch it, old-timer," the young man sneered. Frank steadied himself, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. Something felt off. A group of waiters huddled near the kitchen entrance, their postures tense. One of them kept touching his ear, as if listening to an earpiece. Years of experience screamed at Frank that something was wrong. He inched closer, straining to hear their conversation. "When the speech starts, boss says we grab Blackwell and get out. Clean and quick." Frank's heart raced. A kidnapping right under everyone's noses. He had to do something. But who would believe the old man? He made his way towards Jason, hoping his former colleague would listen. But before he could reach him, the lights went out. Screams erupted as darkness engulfed the mansion. Frank's instincts kicked in. He moved swiftly through the panicked crowd, years of training guiding his steps. He heard a scuffle near the stage where Blackwell had been preparing to speak. Using the chaos as cover, Frank slipped backstage. In the dim emergency lighting, he saw 3 men dragging a struggling Blackwell towards a service exit. Without hesitation, Frank sprang into action. He grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it at the nearest kidnapper. The man went down with a grunt. The other 2 turned, surprise evident on their faces. "Let him go," Frank growled, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. One of the kidnappers laughed. "Step aside, Grandpa. This doesn't concern you." Frank's response was a swift kick to the man's knee, followed by an elbow to his face. The kidnapper crumpled, clutching his broken nose. The last man, still holding Blackwell, pulled out a gun. "Don't be a hero, old man. Walk away and you might live to see another bingo night." Frank's eyes narrowed. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the man, twisting his arm until the gun clattered to the floor. A well-placed strike to the solar plexus, and the final kidnapper was down. Blackwell stared at Frank, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Thompson, how did you—" Before Frank could respond, police sirens wailed in the distance. He helped Blackwell to his feet, scanning for any remaining threats. As the police swarmed the mansion, Frank found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters clamored for interviews, guests praised his bravery, and Blackwell looked at him with newfound respect. But as the adrenaline faded, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The kidnapping had been too easy to foil. And why did Blackwell seem more annoyed than relieved? As dawn broke, Frank sat in Blackwell's opulent office nursing a cup of coffee. The tech mogul paced behind his desk, his earlier gratitude replaced by barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Thompson," Blackwell began, his tone measured, "I must say, your actions last night were unexpected." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Just doing my job, sir." Blackwell's laugh was hollow. Your job is to open doors and polish silverware, not play hero." "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwell, Save it," Blackwell snapped. He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "What you did last night, it complicates things." Frank's instincts, honed over decades, screamed danger. "Complicates what exactly?" Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say that sometimes things aren't what they seem. Now, I'm prepared to offer you a very generous bonus, enough to cover your wife's medical bills for years to come. All you have to do is forget what happened last night. Stick to the official story." Frank's mind raced. The easy takedown, Blackwell's odd behavior, the convenient timing, it all clicked into place. "The kidnapping was fake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackwell's silence was all the confirmation he needed. "Why?" Frank demanded. "Insurance fraud, publicity, take your pick," Blackwell shrugged. "The reasons don't matter. What matters is your silence." Frank stood, his hands shaking with rage. "You'd fake your own kidnapping? Do you have any idea how many people you put at risk?" "Oh, spare me the moral outrage, Thompson," Blackwell sneered. "Everyone has a price. Name yours." Frank thought of Sarah, of the treatment she needed, of the life they could have with Blackwell's money. But then he thought of the terror in the guests' eyes, of the injuries that could have occurred in the panic. "Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Blackwell," Frank said, his voice steady. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, old man. Think of your wife." Frank's hand inched towards his pocket, where his phone sat heavy with an incriminating recording. "I am thinking of her, and of everyone else you've put in danger with your schemes." "You're making a big mistake," Blackwell growled. Frank turned to leave. "No, sir. I think I'm finally doing something right." As he reached for the door handle, Blackwell's voice stopped him cold. "If you walk out that door, Thompson, you're finished. No one will believe the ramblings of a washed-up old man over my word." Frank paused, his hand on the doorknob. Without turning back, he replied, "Maybe, but I'll be able to look my wife in the eye. Can you say the same when you look in the mirror?" With that, Frank stepped out, leaving a seething Blackwell behind. As he walked down the opulent hallway, his steps felt lighter than they had in years. He had a long road ahead, whistleblowing, facing potential retaliation, finding a new job. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself again. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Sarah. "How was work, honey? Everything okay?" Frank smiled, tapping out a reply. "It's been an interesting night. I think it's time for a change. How about we go for a walk in the park? I have quite a story to tell you." As he stepped out into the morning sun, Frank Thompson stood tall. He may have lost a job, but he'd regained something far more valuable: his self-respect. "Mr. Thompson," a voice called out. Frank turned to see Jason, the head of security, jogging towards him. "Mr. Blackwell wants to see you immediately. Says it's urgent." Frank hesitated, his hand tightening around his phone. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline. I no longer work here." Jason's brow furrowed. "What? But after last night, I thought—" "Things aren't always what they seem, Jason," Frank said cryptically. "You might want to remember that." As he walked away, leaving a confused Jason in his wake, Frank couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. One thing was certain: his life was about to change dramatically. Frank's phone buzzed incessantly as he made his way down the winding driveway of Blackwell's estate. He ignored the calls, knowing they were likely from his now ex-employer. The weight of the recorded conversation felt like both a burden and a shield. "You okay, mister?" A young voice pulled Frank from his thoughts. He looked up to see a paperboy on his bicycle, morning edition in hand. Frank managed a small smile. Just fine, son. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but it's always worth it. The boy nodded, clearly not fully understanding but sensing the weight of the moment. As he pedaled away, Frank couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right choice. Sarah's treatment, their mortgage, their future, all hung in the balance. He found Sarah in their modest kitchen, her face pale but her eyes bright as she sipped her morning tea. "Frank, what are you doing home so early?" He sat across from her, taking her hands in his. "Honey, we need to talk." Over the next hour, Frank recounted the events of the previous night and his confrontation with Blackwell. Sarah listened, her expression shifting from shock to concern to pride. "Oh, Frank," she said, squeezing his hand. "You did the right thing. But what happens now?" Before Frank could answer, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Frank approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. His heart sank at the sight of 2 police officers. "Mr. Thompson," one officer asked as Frank opened the door, "we need you to come with us. Mr. Blackwell has some serious allegations against you." Sarah appeared behind Frank, her face etched with worry. "What's going on?" "It's okay, honey," Frank reassured her, though he felt far from certain. He turned to the officers. "May I ask what these allegations are?" The second officer, a stern-faced woman, replied, "Mr. Blackwell claims you've been embezzling funds and that you staged last night's incident to cover your tracks." Frank's jaw dropped. "That's preposterous. I have evidence." "Save it for the station, sir," the male officer cut in. "Please come with us." As Frank was led to the police car, he caught a glimpse of his neighbors peeking through their curtains. The shame and anger burned in his chest, but he held his head high. He knew the truth, and he had to believe that would be enough. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, a far cry from the opulence of Blackwell's mansion. Frank sat alone, his thoughts racing. He'd insisted on waiting for a lawyer, despite the detective's attempts to get him to talk. Hours passed before the door finally opened. A tall, slender woman in a crisp suit entered, her piercing gaze assessing Frank. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Andrea Reeves, your court-appointed attorney," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I understand you have evidence that might exonerate you?" Frank nodded, relief washing over him. "Yes, I recorded my conversation with Blackwell this morning. He admitted to staging the kidnapping." Andrea's eyes widened slightly. "That's significant. May I hear it?" Frank reached for his pocket only to find it empty. His heart sank as he remembered surrendering his phone during processing. "It's on my phone. They took it when I arrived." Andrea frowned. "I'll request access to your personal effects. In the meantime, tell me everything." As Frank recounted his story, Andrea listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. When he finished, she leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mr. Thompson, if what you're saying is true, we're dealing with a powerful man trying to frame you. This won't be easy." Frank's shoulders sagged. "I know, but I have to fight this. Not just for me, but for Sarah and for what's right." Andrea nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media speculation, and emotional turmoil. Frank's face was plastered across local news channels, labeled as everything from a hero-turned-villain to a victim of corporate corruption. Sarah visited as often as she could, her own health taking a back seat to Frank's predicament. "We'll get through this," she'd whisper during their brief moments together, her faith unwavering. It was during one of these visits that a breakthrough finally came. Andrea burst into the visitation room, her usually composed demeanor cracking with excitement. "We got it!" she exclaimed. "The judge granted our request for your phone. The recording is still there, Frank. It's all there." Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but his relief was short-lived. "What about Blackwell? He's got resources, connections. Will this be enough?" Andrea's expression turned serious. "It's a start, but you're right. Blackwell won't go down without a fight. We need more." As if on cue, Frank's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Not all of us agree with what Blackwell did. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th, 10 p.m. Come alone." Frank showed the message to Andrea, his mind racing. It could be a trap, he mused. Or it could be the break we need, Andrea countered. But you can't go alone. It's too risky. Frank pondered for a moment, years of security experience kicking in. What if I wore a wire? You and the police could monitor from a safe distance. Andrea considered this, then nodded slowly. It's dangerous, but it might be our best shot. I'll make the arrangements. As Frank prepared to leave, Sarah caught his hand. Be careful, love. I need you to come back to me. Frank kissed her gently. Always, my dear. We've got a lot of living left to do. That night, as Frank approached the dilapidated warehouse, his heart pounded in his chest. The wire itched against his skin, a constant reminder of the stakes. He took a deep breath and pushed open the rusty door. The interior was dark, save for a single flickering light in the center of the vast space. As Frank's eyes adjusted, he made out a figure standing in the shadows. Mr. Thompson, a familiar voice called out. I was hoping you'd come. Frank squinted, trying to place the voice. Jason, he asked incredulously as Blackwell's head of security stepped into the light. Jason nodded, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. We need to talk, Frank. About Blackwell, about the kidnapping, about everything. As Jason began to speak, Frank realized that the story was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Jason paced nervously, his eyes darting around the warehouse. Frank, you have no idea how deep this goes. Blackwell, he's not just some eccentric billionaire, he's dangerous. Frank leaned against a rusty pillar, his arms crossed. I'm listening. The kidnapping was just the tip of the iceberg, Jason continued, lowering his voice. Blackwell's been involved in everything from money laundering to corporate espionage. I've been gathering evidence for months, but I needed someone on the inside to blow the whistle. Frank's brow furrowed. And you chose me. Why? Jason's lips quirked into a half smile. Because you're the only one who ever stood up to him. I knew if anyone had the guts to take him down, it'd be you. As Jason shared more details, Frank's mind reeled. The scope of Blackwell's crimes was staggering. Offshore accounts, blackmail, even suspected ties to organized crime. It painted a picture of a man who believed himself above the law. I have documents, Jason said, pulling out a flash drive. Financial records, emails, recordings, it's all here. Frank reached for the drive, but Jason pulled back. Not so fast. I'm risking everything by giving you this. I need assurances. What kind of assurances? Immunity? Jason replied. I want a deal. I'll testify against Blackwell, but I need to know I'm protected. Frank nodded slowly. I can't promise anything, but I'll talk to my lawyer. She has connections with the DA's office. Just then, a noise from outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching fast. We've got company, Frank whispered, his old instincts kicking in. Is there another way out? Jason pointed to a back door. Through there, but it's... The main door burst open, revealing several armed men in tactical gear. Freeze! One shouted. Hands where we can see them. Frank's heart raced. This wasn't the police backup he'd arranged. These men moved differently. Their weapons, non-standard. Private security, he realized. Blackwell's men. In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. Jason bolted for the back door, clutching the flash drive. Two of the armed men gave chase. Another approached Frank, weapon raised. Frank's training took over. He ducked under the man's aim, driving his shoulder into the attacker's midsection. They grappled, Frank using every trick he'd learned over decades in security to stay alive. He managed to disarm the man, but not before taking a solid hit to the ribs. Pain flared through his side, but adrenaline kept him moving. He could hear shouts and the sound of a scuffle from the direction Jason had fled. Gritting his teeth, Frank made his way toward the back door. He had to get that flash drive. It was his only chance to clear his name and expose Blackwell. The scene outside was chaos. Jason was pinned down behind a dumpster, exchanging gunfire with Blackwell's men. Frank's appearance provided a momentary distraction, allowing Jason to make a break for it. Frank, Jason called out, tossing the flash drive. Catch! Frank lunged, grabbing the drive midair. A bullet whizzed past his ear, too close for comfort. He tucked and rolled, coming up behind a stack of old crates. Go! Jason yelled, providing covering fire. Get that to the authorities! Frank hesitated, torn between helping Jason and completing the mission. But he knew what had to be done. With a silent prayer for Jason's safety, he ran, disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings. His sides burned as he ran, each breath a struggle. He wasn't as young as he used to be, but desperation lent him speed. He could hear pursuit behind him, gaining ground. Just when he thought he couldn't go on, a familiar voice called out, "Frank, over here!" Andrea's car screeched to a halt beside him. Frank dove in and they peeled away, tires squealing. "What happened?" Andrea demanded as she navigated the dark streets. "We lost audio, and then all hell broke loose." Frank, still catching his breath, held up the flash drive. "Evidence, lots of it. But Blackwell's onto us. We need to get this somewhere safe, fast." Andrea nodded grimly. "I know just the place." As they drove, Frank filled her in on Jason's revelations. Andrea's eyes widened with each new detail. "This is huge, Frank," she said. "If even half of this is true, Blackwell's going away for a long time." They arrived at a nondescript office building. Andrea led Frank inside, using a key card to access a secure elevator. "Where are we?" Frank asked as they descended. "My other office," Andrea replied cryptically. "Let's just say I have friends in high places who are very interested in taking down corrupt billionaires." The elevator opened to reveal a high-tech operations center. Men and women in suits bustled about, their attention focused on multiple screens displaying data and surveillance footage. A stern-looking man approached them. "Ms. Reeves, explain A." Andrea straightened. "Agent Coulson, this is Frank Thompson. He has evidence of major criminal activity involving Ethan Blackwell." Coulson's eyebrows rose slightly. "The tech mogul, we've had suspicions about him for years, but nothing concrete." Frank handed over the flash drive. "This should give you what you need." As the agents got to work analyzing the data, Frank slumped into a chair, the events of the night catching up with him. His ribs throbbed, and worry for Jason gnawed at him. Hours passed in a blur of debriefings and medical checkups. By dawn, the full scope of Blackwell's crimes was becoming clear. The evidence was damning. Coulson approached Frank, his earlier skepticism replaced with respect. "Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. We've been after Blackwell for years, but he's always managed to stay one step ahead. Thanks to you and Mr. Chen's bravery, that ends today." Frank's head snapped up. "Jason? Is he okay?" Coulson nodded. "We extracted him shortly after you escaped. He's in protective custody now." Relief washed over Frank. Then a thought struck him. "Sarah, my wife, she doesn't know." "She's been notified and is on her way," Andrea interjected, placing a comforting hand on Frank's shoulder. "It's over, Frank. You did it." As if on cue, the door burst open and Sarah rushed in. Frank stood, wincing at the pain in his side, but it was forgotten as Sarah enveloped him in a fierce embrace. "Oh, Frank," she sobbed. "I was so worried." He held her tight, breathing in her familiar scent. "It's okay, love. It's all okay now." Over Sarah's shoulder, Frank watched as Agent Coulson coordinated teams for Blackwell's arrest. Screens showed news reports already breaking the story of the tech mogul's spectacular fall from grace. Sarah pulled back, cupping Frank's face in her hands. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be retired, you've had quite an adventure." Frank chuckled, then winced as his ribs protested. "I think I'm ready for that quiet life we talked about. No more excitement for a while." "I don't know," Sarah teased, her eyes twinkling. "I kind of like being married to a hero." As they shared a gentle kiss, Frank realized that while the immediate danger had passed, their story was far from over. There would be trials, testimonies, and no doubt attempts by Blackwell to discredit them. But looking into Sarah's eyes, feeling her unwavering support, Frank knew they could face whatever came next, together. Agent Coulson cleared his throat, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, if you'll follow me, there's someone who'd like to speak with you." Exchanging curious glances, Frank and Sarah followed Coulson to a private office. As the door opened, they found themselves face to face with a familiar figure from the news. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," the person said, extending a hand. "I'm the Attorney General, and I believe we have a lot to discuss about the future of Ethan Blackwell and the safety of this nation." Frank took a deep breath, squeezing Sarah's hand. Whatever came next, he was ready. The old security expert had found a new mission, and this time, he had the full support of those who mattered most. The Attorney General's office was a stark contrast to the bustling operations center. Its wood-paneled walls and plush leather chairs spoke of power and tradition. Frank and Sarah sat side by side, their hands intertwined, as the Attorney General settled behind her imposing desk. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "what you've uncovered goes beyond simple corporate malfeasance. Blackwell's activities pose a significant threat to national security." Frank leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. "How so?" The Attorney General's eyes narrowed. "Blackwell's tech companies have government contracts that give him access to sensitive information. We have reason to believe he's been selling that information to the highest bidder." Sarah gasped softly, and Frank felt her grip tighten on his hand. The implications were staggering. "We need your help, Mr. Thompson," the Attorney General continued. "Your testimony, combined with the evidence you've provided, could be crucial in bringing Blackwell to justice." Frank nodded slowly, his mind racing. "I'll do whatever I can to help, but what about Sarah? Her safety, her treatment?" "Will be fully taken care of," the Attorney General interjected. "We're prepared to offer you both entry into the Witness Protection Program. New identities, relocation, the best medical care for Mrs. Thompson, whatever you need." The offer hung in the air, heavy with promise and uncertainty. Frank turned to Sarah, searching her face. She met his gaze, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "It's your call, love," Sarah said softly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision. He thought of their home, their friends, the life they'd built. But he also thought of Blackwell's crimes, of the lives ruined by his greed and corruption. "We'll do it," Frank said finally, his voice steady. "But I have conditions." The Attorney General raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Jason Chen gets the same deal, full immunity and protection, and I want to be kept in the loop. No shutting me out once you have my testimony." A hint of a smile played at the Attorney General's lips. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Thompson, but given the circumstances, I think we can accommodate your requests." As they hashed out the details, Frank felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Their lives were about to change dramatically, but at least now they had a fighting chance. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Frank and Sarah were moved to a safe house, their days filled with debriefings, medical appointments for Sarah, and preparations for their new lives. Jason, true to the Attorney General's word, was brought into the program as well. Despite the stress of the situation, Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie with the younger man. They'd been through hell together, and that forged a bond that transcended their former roles. One evening, as they sat in the safe house's small living room, Jason turned to Frank, his expression serious. "I never got to thank you properly, for believing in me, for taking the risk." Frank shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who gathered the evidence, who put yourself on the line day after day." "Maybe," Jason conceded, "but it took your courage to bring it all to light. I don't think I could have done it alone." As they talked, Frank realized how much he'd misjudged Jason initially. The cocky exterior hid a sharp mind and a strong moral compass. In another life, they might have made a formidable security team. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who entered the room with a tray of tea. "You boys plotting to save the world again?" she teased. Frank chuckled, pulling her down to sit beside him. "Just reminiscing, love. How are you feeling?" Sarah's smile was brighter than it had been in months. "Better. The new treatment they've got me on? Frank, I think it's working." The joy in her voice brought tears to Frank's eyes. He kissed her forehead gently, silently thanking whatever forces had brought them to this point. As the trial date approached, the safe house became a hive of activity. Lawyers came and went, prepping Frank and Jason for their testimonies. Security protocols were tightened, with armed guards now a constant presence. The night before the trial, Frank couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, staring out at the unfamiliar neighborhood that had been their home for the past weeks. Sarah's soft footsteps approached, and he felt her arms wrap around him from behind. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she murmured. Frank sighed, leaning back into her embrace. "Just thinking about tomorrow, about facing Blackwell again." Sarah rested her chin on his shoulder. "You can do this, Frank. You're the bravest man I know." He turned in her arms, studying her face in the dim light. The worry lines that had been etched there for so long seemed softer now, hope replacing fear in her eyes. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Frank said softly. "Your strength, your faith in me, it's everything, Sarah." They stood there in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The courthouse was a madhouse. Reporters swarmed the steps, clamoring for a glimpse of the key players in what was being called the trial of the decade. Frank, Sarah, and Jason were ushered in through a back entrance, surrounded by a phalanx of federal marshals. As they waited in a small anteroom, Frank's nerves threatened to overwhelm him. He paced back and forth, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Mr. Thompson." A young aide appeared at the door. "They're ready for you." Frank took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Sarah stood, crossing the room to straighten his tie. "Remember," she said, her voice steady, "you're not just speaking for us. You're speaking for everyone Blackwell has hurt, for justice." With a final kiss for luck, Frank followed the aide out of the room. The courtroom fell silent as he entered, all eyes turning to watch his progress to the witness stand. And there, at the defense table, sat Ethan Blackwell. The tech mogul's usual arrogance seemed diminished, his expensive suit doing little to hide the strain of the past weeks. But as Frank passed, Blackwell's eyes met his, and a chill ran down Frank's spine. There was a coldness there, a promise of retribution that no legal proceedings could erase. As Frank took his seat and raised his hand to be sworn in, he pushed aside thoughts of Blackwell's silent threat. He had a job to do, a truth to tell, and nothing, not fear, not threats, not even the weight of his past, would stop him now. The prosecutor approached, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "please tell the court about your employment with Mr. Blackwell." Frank leaned towards the microphone, his voice steady as he began to speak. The story he'd been holding inside for so long finally had a chance to be heard. As he talked, laying out the events that had led to this moment, Frank could feel the mood in the courtroom shift. Disbelief gave way to shock, then to outrage, as the full scope of Blackwell's crimes became clear. Through it all, Frank kept his focus on the truth, on the facts he knew. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a warning. This was only the beginning. Blackwell's reach was long, his resources vast. The battle was far from over. But for now, in this moment, Frank Thompson stood tall, his voice ringing out clear and true. The retired security expert had found a new purpose, a new way to protect and serve. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it head on. As Frank's testimony drew to a close, a palpable tension hung in the air. The prosecution's questions had been incisive, drawing out every damning detail of Blackwell's crimes. Now it was the defense's turn. Blackwell's lawyer, a shark-like woman in a crisp suit, approached the stand. Her eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity that made Frank's skin crawl. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you've painted quite a picture for us today, but I can't help but wonder about your motivations." Frank's eyes narrowed. "My motivations?" "Yes," she continued, pacing before the stand. "You were, by your own admission, relegated to menial tasks at Blackwell Industries. Isn't it possible that this whole story is nothing more than the bitter revenge fantasy of a man past his prime?" Frank felt his temper flare, but he kept his voice level. "No, ma'am, everything I've said here is the truth." The lawyer's smile was razor sharp. "The truth as you see it, perhaps. But let's talk about your history, shall we? You left your previous security firm under less than ideal circumstances, didn't you?" Frank's heart raced. He'd known this might come up, but it still stung. I retired early due to a disagreement with management. A disagreement. The lawyer's eyebrow arched. Or was it because you made a critical error that nearly cost a client their life? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Frank gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white. That situation was more complicated than— A simple yes or no will suffice, Mr. Thompson, the lawyer interrupted. Did you or did you not make a mistake that endangered a client? Frank took a deep breath. Yes, but— Thank you, the lawyer cut him off again. So we've established that your judgment isn't always reliable. Now let's discuss your wife's illness. Frank's eyes snapped to Sarah in the gallery. She sat rigid, her face pale but determined. Objection? The prosecutor stood. Relevance? The judge peered over his glasses. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, counselor. Blackwell's lawyer nodded. Mr. Thompson, your wife's medical treatments are quite expensive, aren't they? Yes, Frank replied, his throat tight. And Mr. Blackwell, in his generosity, had offered to help with those expenses, hadn't he? Frank's jaw clenched. He offered a bribe to keep me quiet. A bribe? The lawyer's tone was incredulous. Or a generous offer from an employer concerned about his employees' welfare. An offer you turned down, leading to financial strain. Isn't it possible, Mr. Thompson, that this entire story is a fabrication? A desperate attempt to discredit Mr. Blackwell and secure a payout? No, Frank said firmly. That's not true. The lawyer's smile was cold. But how can we be sure? After all, we're relying solely on your word and some conveniently produced evidence that could easily have been falsified. Objection. The prosecutor was on her feet again. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, the judge ruled. The jury will disregard the last statement, but Frank could see the damage was done. Doubt had been sown. As he was dismissed from the stand, he caught Blackwell's eye. The tech mogul's smirk sent a chill down Frank's spine. The rest of the trial passed in a blur of testimonies and legal arguments. Jason's turn on the stand was equally grueling, with Blackwell's lawyer trying to paint him as a disgruntled employee out for revenge. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Frank felt a gnawing uncertainty. Had they done enough? Would justice prevail against Blackwell's wealth and influence? Days passed, each hour stretching into an eternity of waiting. Frank, Sarah, and Jason remained sequestered in a hotel, the strain of uncertainty taking its toll. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. Frank was awakened by an urgent knocking at their door. Heart pounding, he opened it to find one of their protective detail, his face grim. Mr. Thompson, we need to move you. Now. What's happening? Sarah asked, pulling on a robe. The agent's voice was tense. There's been a security breach. Someone tried to access your location. As they hurriedly packed, Frank's mind raced. Had Blackwell found them? Was this a last-ditch attempt to silence them before the verdict? They were rushed to a waiting car, the pre-dawn streets eerily empty. As they sped through the city, Frank noticed a black SUV following them. We've got a tail, he said, his old instincts kicking in. The agent driving cursed under his breath. Hold on. What followed was a heart-stopping chase through the city. The agent's evasive driving was impressive, but their pursuers were relentless. Sarah clung to Frank, her eyes wide with fear. Just when it seemed they might shake their tail, disaster struck. A truck pulled out suddenly, forcing their driver to swerve. The car spun, slamming into a lamppost. Dazed but unharmed, Frank helped Sarah out of the wreck. The agent was unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. We need to run, Frank said, his voice urgent. Can you make it? Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. They took off down a side street, the sound of approaching footsteps spurring them on. As they ran, Frank's mind worked furiously. They needed a plan, a place to hide. Then he remembered, an old safe house from his security days, not far from here. If it still existed, it might be their only hope. They ducked into alleyways, doubling back and using every trick Frank knew to lose their pursuers. Finally, breathless and aching, they arrived at a nondescript apartment building. Frank led Sarah to a basement entrance, praying the old codes still worked. To his relief, the door clicked open. Inside, the safe house was dusty but intact. Frank quickly secured the entrance and did a sweep of the small apartment. "We should be safe here for now," he told Sarah, helping her to a worn couch. "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded, though her hands were shaking. "Frank, what's going on? Who were those people?" Frank sank down beside her, his mind reeling. "I don't know for sure, but I'd bet my last dollar Blackwell's behind this. He must be getting desperate." As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of their situation set in. They were cut off from their protection, from Jason, from any news of the trial. For all they knew, the verdict could have come in, and this was Blackwell's attempt at revenge. Frank found an old radio and tried to tune into a news station. Through the static, they caught fragments of a breaking story. Jury reached a verdict. Blackwell Industries CEO. Shocking turn of events. Frank and Sarah exchanged glances, hope and fear warring in their eyes. Whatever the outcome, they knew their ordeal was far from over. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the dusty windows of the safe house, Frank realized that the next few hours would likely determine not just the fate of the trial, but their very lives. He took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we're in this together." Sarah's smile was tired but genuine. Always. As they sat there, waiting for news or for their pursuers to find them, Frank couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn his life had taken. From a washed-up security guard to a key witness in the trial of the century, and now a fugitive in his own city. But looking at Sarah, feeling the strength of her presence beside him, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. The radio crackled again, and they leaned in, straining to hear the news that would shape their future. Frank and Sarah huddled close to the old radio, straining to hear through the static. Suddenly the signal cleared, and a reporter's voice came through crisp and clear. "In a stunning conclusion to the trial of the century, tech mogul Ethan Blackwell has been found guilty on all counts." The jury delivered their verdict after just 6 hours of deliberation, citing the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly tempered by caution. They weren't out of danger yet. The reporter continued. In a shocking twist, Blackwell attempted to flee the courtroom upon hearing the verdict. He was quickly apprehended by federal marshals. Sources say he may face additional charges for this escape attempt. Frank's mind raced. If Blackwell had tried to run, it meant he had resources in place. Resources that might still be hunting them. As if on cue, they heard a noise from outside, the crunch of gravel under tires. Frank moved silently to the window, peering out through a gap in the dusty blinds. A black SUV had pulled up, identical to the one that had chased them earlier. "We need to move," Frank whispered urgently. "There's another exit through the back. If we're quick and quiet, we might be able to slip away." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. They gathered what little they had and made their way to the hidden back door. Frank eased it open, checking for any signs of danger. The alley behind the safe house was clear, for now. They slipped out, keeping to the shadows. Frank's years of security training kicked in, guiding them through a maze of back streets and hidden passages. They had gone about 3 blocks when they heard shouts behind them. Their pursuers had discovered their escape. "This way," Frank said, pulling Sarah into a narrow space between 2 buildings. They pressed themselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe as footsteps thundered past their hiding place. Once the sound had faded, they continued their flight. Frank's mind worked furiously, trying to formulate a plan. They needed help, but who could they trust? As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with a figure. Frank's fist was already rising when he recognized the face. "Jason," he gasped. The younger man looked as surprised as they were. "Frank, Sarah, thank God. We've been looking everywhere for you." Before they could respond, Jason was ushering them into a waiting car. Inside, they found Andrea, Frank's lawyer, looking worried but relieved. "What happened?" Frank demanded as the car pulled away. "How did you find us?" Jason explained as they drove. "When we got word of the verdict, Blackwell went nuts. He had a backup plan in place, a team to take out key witnesses. We managed to intercept some communications and figured out you were in danger." Andrea picked up the narrative. "We've been working with the FBI to round up Blackwell's remaining operatives. When we lost contact with your protective detail, we feared the worst." Sarah squeezed Frank's hand. "So it's over? Really over?" Andrea's smile was tired but genuine. "Almost. There's still some cleanup to do, statements to take. But yes, Blackwell's going away for a long, long time." As the adrenaline of their escape faded, exhaustion set in. Frank felt the weight of the past weeks, no, the past years, settling on his shoulders. But mixed with the fatigue was a sense of triumph, of justice finally served. They were taken to a secure FBI facility where they were reunited with their protective detail, battered but alive, and debriefed on the events of the past 24 hours. As dawn broke, Frank found himself standing by a window, looking out over the city. Sarah joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Penny, for your thoughts," she murmured. Frank chuckled softly. "Just thinking about how much our lives have changed. A few months ago, I was a washed-up security guard, and now you're a hero," Sarah finished for him. Frank shook his head. "No, not a hero. Just a man who decided to do the right thing." Sarah turned him to face her, her eyes shining with pride and love. "That's exactly what makes you a hero, Frank Thompson." Their moment was interrupted by Jason, who approached with a broad smile. "Hey, lovebirds. Got some news you might want to hear." They followed him to where Andrea was speaking with an FBI agent. As they approached, Andrea turned to them, her expression a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "The FBI was going through Blackwell's accounts, and they found something interesting. It seems our Mr. Blackwell had a guilty conscience after all." Frank's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Andrea's smile widened. "He set up a trust fund. For you, Frank. And for Sarah's medical care. It's substantial." Sarah gasped. "But why, after everything?" The FBI agent stepped forward. "From what we can tell, it was set up shortly after the fake kidnapping attempt. Our theory is that Mr. Thompson's actions that night affected Blackwell more than he let on. This was his way of making amends, I suppose." Frank felt dizzy. After everything they'd been through, all the fear and uncertainty, to have their future secured in such an unexpected way, it was almost too much to process. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrea placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now you rest, heal. In a few weeks, once the media frenzy has died down, we'll work on getting you both back to something resembling a normal life. If that's what you want, of course." Frank looked at Sarah, seeing his own mix of emotions reflected in her eyes. They had been through so much, seen the darkest side of humanity, but also experienced incredible acts of bravery and kindness. "I think," Frank said slowly, "that after all this, normal might be a bit boring." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to chase away the last shadows of their ordeal. "Well, my love, I'm sure we can find some way to keep things interesting. Maybe start a security consulting firm? I hear there's a market for experts who can outwit billionaire criminals." As they all chuckled at the idea, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was filled with possibility rather than dread. In the days and weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Frank and Sarah moved to a quiet suburb, their new home protected by state-of-the-art security systems installed personally by Jason, who had become a close friend. Sarah's health improved dramatically with access to cutting-edge treatments. Frank found himself in demand as a security consultant, his experience with the Blackwell case giving him a unique perspective on corporate crime. They never forgot the lessons of their ordeal, the importance of standing up for what's right, the strength found in unity, and the power of second chances. One evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to Frank with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know, for a retired security guard, you've had quite the adventure." Frank laughed, pulling her close. "Adventure? I'd say we're just getting started." As the sky turned to gold, Frank Thompson reflected on the twisted path that had led him here. From a man who felt his best days were behind him, to someone who had helped bring down one of the most powerful criminals in the country. It wasn't the life he had expected, but as he held Sarah in his arms, he knew it was the life he was meant to have. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. And whatever challenges it might bring, Frank knew they would face them together, older, wiser, and stronger than ever before. As night fell, the Thompsons headed inside, ready for whatever adventure tomorrow might bring. For in the end, they had discovered the greatest security of all, the love and trust they shared, and the knowledge that no matter what life threw at them, they would always have each other's backs. And so, as one chapter of their lives closed, another began, filled with hope, purpose, and the unshakable bond forged in the crucible of their extraordinary journey.